in the end, the world, as it often does, will muddle through these problems. But what I'm really looking out for is how exactly the political domestic response will be of everyday Israelis to a government that is now legally implicated in all of this.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. On Monday, May 20th, the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, applied for arrest warrants for 3 senior Hamas leaders and for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. The Hamas leaders include the top official in Gaza, Yahyah Sinwar, Hamas's military commander, Muhammad Deif, and Ismail Haniyeh, the Qatar-based political leader of Hamas. These 3 men were charged with crimes related to the October 7th attack and their treatment of hostages in captivity. On the Israeli side, Netanyahu and Gallant were charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity, including using starvation as a method of warfare. This was a fairly earth-shattering moment in the history of the International Criminal Court, but for those of you who subscribe to the Global Dispatches newsletter, you'll know that I've been expecting this particular shoe to drop since November, when Karim Khan first warned Hamas and Israeli officials that his office has jurisdiction in relation to this conflict. Well, this ICC action has now happened, and on the line with me to discuss what this application for arrest warrants means and where this ICC case may be headed next is Mark Kirsten. He is an assistant professor of criminal justice and criminology at the University of the Fraser Valley in British Columbia and specializes in international law. He's also a senior consultant at the Wayamo Foundation. We kick off discussing the specific charges leveled against these 5 men, and then have a broader conversation about the impact this action by the ICC may have on the trajectory of this conflict. I dare say you will not find a more informed conversation about the ICC from any other podcast out there, so I trust you will learn from this. I have been covering the International Criminal Court as one of the core parts of my beat for nearly as long as the court has been in existence. And Mark Kirsten is always one of my go-to experts on all things ICC. To support Global Dispatches and our continuing coverage of international justice, please become a paying supporter to Global Dispatches at globaldispatches.org. You can sign up for the newsletter there and also support our work with your paid contributions. Thank you. Now here is my conversation with Mark Kirsten. What were the charges that Prosecutor Khan is seeking against these 5 individuals?
In relation to the 3 members of Hamas, there was a mixture of crimes against humanity and war crimes, including extermination as a crime against humanity, murder as a crime against humanity, taking hostages as a war crime, rape and sexual violence as crimes against humanity and war crimes, torture as a crime against humanity and a war crime, other inhumane acts as a crime against humanity, cruel treatment as a war crime, and outrages upon personal dignity as a war crime, which is often outrages on personal dignity might be, like posing for photographs with the deceased or doing something with the deceased, with someone who's been killed. And then in relation to the Israeli officials, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, and Yoav Gallant, the minister of defense, there's also a combination of war crimes and crimes against humanity that the ICC prosecutor is seeking charges for, including starvation as a method of warfare, as a war crime, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to the body or health as a war crime, or cruel treatment as a war crime, willful killing as a war crime, murder as a war crime, intentionally directing attacks against civilians as a war crime, extermination and or murder as a crime against humanity, persecution and other inhumane acts as crimes against humanity. And one thing that I kind of want to emphasize is that since October 7th, but even before that too, but especially since October 7th, and all of these crimes relate to things that have happened since October 7th and subsequently, is that our emphasis has been on war crimes. And to a certain extent, because of the case at the International Court of Justice on this question of genocide. And what we haven't been thinking about enough, or perhaps paying enough attention, and I mentioned this months ago too, is this idea of crimes against humanity.
Can you just distinguish the two for those who aren't familiar? What is the difference between a war crime and a crime against humanity?
There's overlap, and as I listed the kind of things that these individuals have been charged with, I noted a couple of that are being charged as both a war crime and a crime against humanity. But the context in which they happen and the legal rules around them are different. So a war crime has to be an international crime that is committed in the context of a non-international armed conflict or an international armed conflict. And actually, the ICC prosecutor in his request for warrants stated clearly that he had found both, that there's an international armed conflict between Palestine and Israel, and a non-international armed conflict between Israel and Hamas. And that's important because right now, starvation as a method of warfare is a war crime only in non-international armed conflicts, not international armed conflicts. So he found both. And so a war crime has to be committed in the context of an armed conflict, and then is governed by a series of very important rules. So obviously you can't direct attacks against civilians, that's clear. But then different types of attacks, say on, hospitals or clinics or schools or parliaments or whatever it is, or communities, if it's a war crime, it has to pass a number of legal thresholds, like, was it proportional? Was it militarily necessary? Was there sufficient distinction made between people who can be targeted, so belligerents, people actively engaged in hostilities, versus civilians, etc. And that's a very complex space that is governed by international humanitarian law. So think of the Geneva Conventions, etc., and international criminal law for the ICC under the Rome Statute. And crimes against humanity are different. So crimes against humanity are newer historically than war crimes, which date back to the 19th century. But crimes against humanity and genocide actually emerged at a similar time, but with different kind of theoretical thinking around what motivated the crime. So obviously genocide is focused on the group. Finding of genocide requires a finding that a perpetrator intentionally sought to destroy a particular group in whole or in part, and then did that, right? Had actually acted it out. Whereas a crime against humanity doesn't focus so much on the group. Instead, its underlying theory is that certain crimes are so terrible, whether or not they happen in context of war or not in war, in some other form of conflict that doesn't amount to an armed conflict, but they're so bad that they're actually crimes not only against the direct victims, but they're also a crime against all of humanity. So rather than focusing on the group, they kind of suggest that these crimes are a violation of our shared humanity and our shared ethos as human beings.
So, like, in theory, you and I are victims of a crime against humanity, or the crime against humanity perpetrated by Hamas against the Israelis, and then perpetrated allegedly by Netanyahu and Gallant against the Palestinians in Gaza. It like diminishes all of our humanity when such things are allowed to happen. That's like the theoretical basis.
Yeah, so we don't actually have the standing as victims, but humanity is implicated in this as opposed to just the direct victims, so to speak. So it is trying to evoke this shared humanity as being violated in and of itself. And then the rules around crimes against humanity are also slightly different.
So we have these suite of charges that you've just described, mostly stemming on the Hamas side of the ledger from Hamas's attacks on October 7th and the subsequent kidnapping and treatment of hostages. And then on the Israeli side of the ledger, crimes allegedly stemming from their response to October 7th. And I say chief among them is this alleged conspiracy to starve the people of Gaza as a method of war. So procedurally, what happens next? We have an application for these arrest warrants. What is now the ICC doing?
So the ICC has only asked for arrest warrants to be issued, and he has to ask the pre-trial chamber, which is a panel of 3 judges that have to consume or take into account his request. And then those 3 judges will ultimately together decide whether or not to issue those arrest warrants. And a couple of things are important to note in this respect. One is the legal test that has to be passed. So for the judges to issue the warrants, they have to find that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the individuals listed in the prosecutor's request for arrest warrants have committed the crimes that are also listed in that request. So reasonable grounds to believe, and that's a very low threshold. It's lower than the legal threshold that's required to confirm charges against those individuals. And it's, of course, much, much lower than what is needed for conviction, which is, as people will know, beyond a reasonable doubt, as it is in any criminal law process. So the judges will have this information now, and they have to decide whether there are reasonable grounds to believe this low legal threshold that these individuals are involved or responsible for the crimes in the prosecutor's request. And here it's important to note that the prosecutor didn't kind of go it alone or just use the resources within his office. Prosecutor Khan put together a panel of experts that included experts like Milan Markovic, Amal Clooney, and also had the support of very senior, esteemed war crimes experts like Kevin John Heller, etc. And they helped the prosecutor and his team of investigators really ensure that once they made this request, as they did yesterday, that it would be as robust and ready for the issuance of arrest warrants. So it's quite significant, the amount of work that has been put into this. And of course, many people were frustrated with how much time the ICC prosecutor was taken. But the more important thing is that he does things properly, and it appears that he did things properly.
I just say it wasn't that long of a time. I mean, since October 6th till now is a very swift process, at least in terms of how the ICC has historically acted. So
Absolutely. I think you're right. If you follow this stuff, then it doesn't seem that long. But then, of course, people are wondering how long will it take these judges to make their decision?
Well, that was going to be my next question for you. Yeah, like historically, what do we know about how long it takes pre-trial chamber judges to confirm or deny arrest warrants? Like, what's an average here?
I don't know what the average is, but it really depends on a couple of things. So one, I think there'll be pressures both ways. So I listed all of the charges at the beginning in response to your question, which makes for a more comprehensive request, but also means that those judges have to sift through all of the information, right? If you take the example of Vladimir Putin, who had an arrest warrant issued for him in March, I believe, of 2023, that was on one charge. It was on the war crime of forcibly transferring Ukrainian children to Russia or Russian held territory. And in that instance, I think it took just under a month for the judges to get the request and then issue the arrest warrant. Here you have 5 individuals, 3 from Hamas and 3 from Israel, and then multiple charges, both of war crimes and crimes against humanity, that are listed in the prosecutor's request. So it may take more time. What the judges can also do is, if they're not sure about something, in the request, they can absolutely go back to the prosecutor and ask for clarification. So while I think that it's virtually guaranteed that arrest warrants will be issued, the exact time is really hard to say.
So, to what extent do judges in this stage of the process weigh the principle of complementarity? This is an idea underpinning the International Criminal Court that basically stipulates that the ICC is a court of last resort that only takes action when national or local jurisdictions are unable or unwilling to take action. Now, with the state of Palestine and in Gaza in particular, there's no like functioning judiciary to take on the prosecution of Hamas. Whereas in Israel, I mean, there is a functioning judiciary that frankly has prosecuted this very sitting prime minister, Netanyahu. He's in the midst of a few criminal trials. So there is like in theory at least, a functioning judiciary there. Are pretrial chamber judges considering complementarity at all?
Your assessment, or your description, I should say, of complementarity is right at the second stage. But the first stage of the complementarity test, where a state or an individual who is facing prosecution at the ICC can challenge the admissibility of that case or investigation, the first part of the test is actually, is the state active? And then if the state is active, then the question is it able and willing to conduct those investigations and prosecutions in a genuine manner? So at this point, that's not the case, right? And to go back to how complementarity works, it has to be for the same person and for the same underlying conduct. So what that means is that in order to challenge the admissibility of the case against, say, Benjamin Netanyahu at the ICC and say this stuff can be done in Israeli courts and the Israeli justice system, then the Israeli justice system would have to open an investigation into Benjamin Netanyahu for the same conduct that the ICC prosecutor is alleging. So all of those various things. They don't have to be war crimes and crimes against humanity, but it has to be the same underlying conduct that he is engaged in, which the ICC prosecutor is calling war crimes and crimes against humanity. And if a justice system is inactive, then there is no complementarity test to be met whatsoever. There's no admissibility challenge to make because there's nothing happening. So you can have a Cadillac justice system, but if it's inactive, then it doesn't matter. The other thing is, in order to issue that admissibility challenge, Israel would have to do something that I'm not sure it really wants to do. The extent to which it would have to do this is kind of up for debate. But it would actually have to recognize that the ICC procedures and investigations were valid and therefore officially challenge it in a legal admissibility challenge that would indirectly or directly recognize the ICC as a legitimate institution in this conflict.
Yes, that's interesting. So, like, just because Netanyahu is getting prosecuted for like campaign finance shenanigans in Israeli courts, the fact that there's no like open investigation into alleged war crimes suggests that the Israeli court system is not up to that particular task. So you think that it's almost certain that these charges will be confirmed, that arrest warrants will be issued. Can I just have you just articulate what you foresee to be some of the real world consequences of arrest warrants being issued for these five men? Like, look, this is not like the first rodeo of the ICC in going after both non-state actors like Hamas, nor heads of state like Benjamin Netanyahu. Like, we sort of know what to expect. So what do you foresee being some of the bigger implications in the real world of these actions?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to compare this situation to others because of the particular state and its relationship to Western states.
Yeah, Karim Khan called this situation the San Andreas fault of international relations.
There you go, right? And he knows, right?
He's standing on it.
Exactly. He's standing on it. He's receiving threats, intimidation, and interventions left, right, and center from elected leaders and others, and also a lot of support. So, I mean, I think it'll be the gamut. It'll run the gamut. You will see the United States, which is already acting, rather, I would say, with a degree of hysteria in response to the prosecutor's request. Why they continue to threaten things like sanctions and deride the ICC on these matters is kind of, I'll never fully understand, in the sense that every time they do that, much of the rest of the world thinks, well, of course the United States is going to be livid about this. And if the United States is livid about this, doesn't that suggest that the prosecutor is doing the right thing?
Spoken like a true Canadian.
Well, yeah, I'm curious actually what Canada says, because Canada actually hasn't issued a statement yet. So we'll see. Actually, I wasn't thinking so much of Canada, although I think it will have that impact, but more, in the vast majority of the quote unquote global south, etc. So I think there'll be those types of reactions. I think geopolitically it could have some implications. A lot of that depends on the kind of consumption of these arrest warrants on top of everything else, on top of the International Court of Justice case, on top of the denial of aid and various attacks and news media and coverage, etc., and how all of that is consumed by the Israeli public and the Israeli opposition. I mean, Netanyahu is not a particularly popular person in Israel. Gallant is not a particularly popular person politically in Israel either. And I think there's an open question as to, how will the Israeli public respond to these ICC arrest warrants in a kind of domestic political scene. I think most will be upset about this. Most will oppose the ICC and its arrest warrants for lots of different reasons, including the kind of media that they'll be consuming around it. But they also have to make a decision as to how this makes the Israeli government and therefore the state appear, and whether indeed they want to be led by two individuals in part who aren't only now implicated in these atrocities by way of the International Criminal Court, but also who will not legally, at least, be allowed to travel to 124 states around the world who have signed on to the International Criminal Court's Rome Statute. So I think there'll be lots of impacts. I think it'll run the gamut. I tend to think that if you take the most extreme views, they're the least correct. If someone thinks that this will ruin peace in the Middle East, that's not true. If someone thinks that this will bring about peace, I also think that's not true. If someone thinks that this will break the world of international law, I don't think that's true. And if anyone thinks that this will save the world of international law, I also don't think that's true. So I think in the end, the world, as it often does, will muddle through these problems. But what I'm really looking out for is how exactly the political domestic response will be of everyday Israelis to a government that is now legally implicated in all of this.
I mean, that question of Israeli domestic politics, I think, is really interesting because, just a week ago, Gallant and Netanyahu were very publicly feuding over the strategy in Gaza, with Gallant saying publicly that Netanyahu has no plans for a strategy for securing places in Gaza that Israel claims to have rid from Hamas, and that like the two options are perpetual Israeli occupation or Hamas taking over, both of which are bad, and that Netanyahu has no strategy to the latter. Then Netanyahu shot back. And so these two were feuding pretty viciously publicly a week ago. And now they're like lumped together, both as targets of an ICC investigation. What's interesting to me is how you would distinguish between the ways in which an ICC warrant, if it is issued, impacts the strategic thinking or ability of Netanyahu or Gallant to move around in this world, as opposed to that of the three senior Hamas leaders. I mean, let's be clear, Hamas is a terrorist organization. Israel is a Western-style democracy. How they approach these kinds of international legal actions is going to differ. So whereas I've seen a lot of speculation discussion along the lines of what you just said about how Netanyahu and Gallant won't be able to go to any countries that are signatories of the ICC, how it will really sort of malign them internationally. It's hard for me to imagine that same applies to Hamas and the Hamas leaders. How do you expect these warrants to have any sort of real world impact on Hamas?
Yeah, it's a good question. And obviously, for both Hamas and for Israeli officials, just because ICC member states have a legal obligation to enforce arrest warrants, as we know from history and the travels of former Sudanese President Omar al Bashir, does not mean that they will actually do it, right? In both instances. But we don't know. We don't have an example yet. I agree that this kind of travel problem is less likely to impact Hamas because of where they're located. I don't think Qatar is going to act on these arrest warrants, or some of the, if they travel to Iran or whatever, they're not going to enforce these arrest warrants. But one thing is at least worthwhile looking out for, which is that late last month in April, Lebanon moved towards accepting the ICC's jurisdiction. And that may not create immediate obligations on Lebanon, which is not a member state of the ICC, to kind of enforce any arrest warrants should Hamas perpetrators end up on their territory. But if that continues to develop and Lebanon does join the ICC, or does kind of end up in a situation where the public feels compelled to support the ICC in a meaningful way, then I think Lebanon could play a very significant role, both potentially with the enforcement of arrest warrants. Again, very hypothetical, and maybe I'm being too hopeful here, but it could potentially play that role. And as well, obviously, there have been allegations of international crimes committed, not only by Israel, but by groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so, one thing I would say, Mark, we've known each other and been talking about these issues for a long time. And I think one of the few things that I think is true of this crazy world of international criminal law is that when things happen, they typically happen when no one expects them to. I mean, in terms of, people actually being arrested and brought to the ICC. There are very few instances where I had any clue that an individual would end up at the ICC after an arrest warrant was issued. And I follow this, I think, as closely as I possibly can, and have for many years. So there's a degree of unpredictability here that makes it very difficult to kind of take out that crystal ball and say, well, these will be the implications for this group and these will be the implications for that group. It really remains to be seen. And just like with Lebanon potentially accepting ICC jurisdiction over international crimes, there are these political changes that may seem small or may seem kind of disparate, or whatever you want to call them, that might actually end up having significant consequences in the future if all of the kind of quote unquote stars align for an arrest and enforcement of an arrest warrant and surrender to the ICC.
So, here in the United States, we've seen a very consistent response by, American political leaders across the spectrum, from Biden and Blinken to Republicans in Congress, really sort of beside themselves that the ICC would take actions against both Israeli leaders and Hamas leaders, calling them sort of equivalent, that there would be some sort of equivalence between Israel, a democratically elected country, and Hamas, a terrorist organization. As you're reading these remarks, even from President Biden himself, what's coming across your mind? Like, how are you approaching this question of the so-called equivalence?
Yeah, I mean, my overall impression is that these comments have nothing to do with equivalence. I don't think Joe Biden or the dozens, or whatever, the half dozen or whatever it is, dozen Congress people who are anti-ICC and anti-accountability, and those who are putting out this threat of equivalency, I don't think they would be satisfied if the ICC issued 1,000 arrest warrants for Hamas leaders and one for an Israeli government official. I think there's every reason to believe what they mean by using this rhetoric of equivalency is just only go for Hamas. Do not endorse anything but impunity for Israeli officials. That's how I read it, knowing what those very same individuals have said in the past and where they stand, and, the anti-Palestinian and anti-accountability rhetoric that they have endorsed. And at the same time, from a legal perspective or from just understanding how the ICC works, the ICC doesn't compare perpetrators. There's nothing in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court that says, at this stage, the prosecutor should weigh balance between different sets of perpetrators. I mean, that's not how law works. That's certainly not how international criminal law works. What you do is simply say, okay, there's an individual who's suspected of having committed atrocity X or atrocity Y. We have to follow the evidence. And if that specific individual can be found to have committed those atrocities or that international crime, that war crime, that crime against humanity, then they are candidates to have an arrest warrant issued against them. If there's any kind of equivalency that I think the ICC can and should, and in some ways does do, and perhaps is doing better more now than before, is the equivalency between victims and survivors, right? I don't think kids, well, it's just true. Kids do not starve differently because of the color of their skin and the nationality of that they come from, or the flag of the country they're from, or the state that they're from. They don't die differently from bombs. Victims and survivors, in my view, deserve equal access to accountability and justice for the atrocity crimes that are committed against them. And so I think any suggestion to the contrary risks simply not being about equivalency at all. But as I said before, is really just a red herring argument for impunity.
I mean, democratically elected leaders can indeed commit war crimes. And if they do, they ought to be held accountable, just as leaders of terrorist organizations ought to be held accountable. Like, the political system that drives them to power does not absolve them of their responsibility for following international humanitarian law. I mean, presumably in a democratic system, you'd have local courts take up the case. But as we're seeing, that's not what's happening in Israel right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, that would obviously be the ideal, is some kind of transformational moment where there is active, legitimate investigations and prosecutions by the Israeli authorities. But I mean, we're at a stage now where, and these two individuals have not been targets of ICC warrants being requested by the prosecutor, at least not publicly. Maybe they're under seal. But, we're at the stage where people like Minister Ben Gvir or Minister Smotrich can invoke genocidal language repeatedly, and they're not even kicked out of cabinet, let alone prosecuted for the invocation of horrifically violent language. So, look, this is what I'd say. It is unique that in this type of democracy, although this isn't the first time the ICC has intervened in democracies, but with this robust of a justice system, and I agree with you that in a democracy like Israel has, there is an ideal where these international crimes can and should be prosecuted in their own justice system. That would absolutely be the ideal, and it is an available option to the Israeli authorities. Whether or not it takes up that opportunity remains to be seen, and I don't think there's anything suggesting that they will anytime soon, but it is the appropriate response of a democracy to these types of allegations.
Mark, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Mark, thank you for having me. As always, it's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.